Imagine being taken from your family in the middle of the night. Not because you'd done anything wrong, not because you were a danger to anyone, but because your husband wanted you gone, or your father wanted your inheritance, or your family was simply embarrassed by you. Now imagine being locked away for the rest of your life, in a building with barred windows, with strangers who don't speak your language, with doctors who don't believe a word you say. And when you die, years later, decades later, your grave has no name, just a number, if there's a grave at all. Let me ask you something. How many women do you think were locked away in mental asylums in the 19th and 20th centuries because they were inconvenient? Not crazy, not dangerous, just inconvenient. The number is staggering, and for most of them, there's no record, no trial, no appeal, just a signature from a husband or a father, and a lifetime behind walls. This isn't a story about mad women. It's a story about women who were labeled mad because powerful men found them inconvenient. And here's the part that should terrify you. Some of them weren't poor, they weren't powerless, they weren't without family. They were wives of wealthy men, daughters of prominent families, women with money, with status, with connections. None of it mattered, because once the word hysteria was written on their chart, they ceased to exist as people. They became patients, cases, problems to be managed. Let me take you inside the asylums, and let me show you what happened to the women they locked away. Let me introduce you to a word, hysteria. It comes from the Greek word for uterus, hystera. For thousands of years, doctors believed that women's wombs could wander through their bodies, causing all sorts of problems: anxiety, irritability, depression, sexual desire that wasn't properly controlled. By the 19th century, hysteria had become a catch-all diagnosis for any woman who didn't conform. If you were too emotional, you were hysterical. If you weren't emotional enough, you were hysterical. If you wanted sex, you were hysterical. If you didn't want sex, you were hysterical. If you argued with your husband, you were hysterical. If you were too quiet, you were hysterical. The diagnosis meant you could be locked away, and the only person who needed to sign the papers was your husband or your father or your brother. Let me ask you, how many women do you think were locked away by husbands who simply wanted them gone? We don't know the exact number, but we know it was common, shockingly common. One doctor in the 19th century wrote that irritable wives were the most frequent admissions to asylums. Another wrote that women who disobeyed their husbands were prime candidates for commitment. In the United States alone, by the 1950s, there were over 500,000 people in mental institutions. A significant percentage were women committed by their families. Let me tell you about one of them. 1860, Jacksonville, Illinois. Elizabeth Packard is a 44-year-old mother of 6. She's intelligent, educated, opinionated. Her husband, Theophilus Packard, is a Presbyterian minister. They've been married for over 20 years. But Elizabeth has committed a terrible crime. She started thinking for herself. She's read books her husband disapproves of. She's questioned his religious teachings. She's expressed opinions that don't match his. Theophilus decides he's had enough. One night, he calls a doctor to their home. He tells the doctor that Elizabeth is insane, that she has an above-average amount of pride and a morbid mental irritability, that she's a danger to herself and her children. Elizabeth is given no examination, no hearing, no chance to defend herself. The doctor signs the commitment papers, and Elizabeth is taken to the Illinois State Hospital for the insane. Let me pause here and ask you something. What does it say about a society when a husband can lock away his wife with a single doctor's signature and no evidence? Elizabeth spent 3 years in the asylum. 3 years locked away from her children. 3 years surrounded by women who had been committed for equally flimsy reasons. When she finally got out, after a legal battle that went all the way to the governor, she did something extraordinary. She wrote a book, then another, then another. She documented her experience. She named names. She described the conditions, and she fought to change the laws. Because of Elizabeth Packard, Illinois passed a law requiring jury trials for anyone committed to an asylum. Other states followed. Her activism helped create the legal safeguards that exist today. But here's the question Elizabeth herself asked. What about the women who didn't have her education, her money, her ability to write and publish? What about the women whose husbands simply wanted them gone and who had no one to fight for them? They stayed in the asylums, some for decades, some for the rest of their lives. And when they died, they were buried in unmarked graves, if they were buried at all. Now let me take you inside the asylums themselves. These weren't hospitals in any sense we'd recognize. They were warehouses, massive, overcrowded, understaffed institutions where thousands of women were stored out of sight. Take the Willard Asylum in New York. When it opened in 1869, it was designed for 200 patients. By 1890, it held over 1,500. By 1950, over 4,000. Women slept in dormitories with dozens of others. They were given sedatives to keep them quiet. They were subjected to treatments that sound like torture, ice baths, restraints, electroshock therapy, lobotomies. Let me ask you, if you were locked away, drugged, and shocked for disagreeing with your husband, who would you become? Some of these women went genuinely mad in the asylums, not because they were mad when they arrived, because the conditions drove them mad. One former patient described her experience. They take away your clothes, your name, your dignity. They give you a number and a uniform. They tell you when to eat, when to sleep, when to use the bathroom. And if you resist, they strap you down and put ice on your head until you stop fighting. The asylums were also factories of forgotten death. At Willard, over 5,000 patients died between 1869 and 1995. They were buried in a cemetery on the grounds. Their graves were marked with simple metal tags, just numbers. No names, no dates, no indication that these were human beings with lives and families and stories. It wasn't until the 1990s that a woman named Lisa G. found the cemetery. She was working at Willard as a psychiatric aide. She started researching the numbers. She found patient records. She began matching numbers to names. She spent years giving back the identities of women who had been buried as numbers. Let me ask you, how many other asylums have cemeteries like this? How many other women are buried under numbers, waiting for someone to find them? We don't know, because the records were often destroyed. The patients were often erased. The families who committed them often didn't want them remembered. The asylums were designed to make inconvenient people disappear, and for the most part, they succeeded. Now let me tell you about something even more disturbing. In the early 20th century, doctors began performing a surgery on difficult women. It was called a lobotomy. The procedure involved inserting a metal instrument through the eye socket or drilling into the skull and severing connections in the prefrontal cortex. The inventor, Dr. Walter Freeman, performed thousands of lobotomies. He'd drive across the country in a van he called the Lobomobile, performing surgeries in hospitals and sometimes in hotels. His patients? Often women whose families found them difficult. Women with depression, women with anxiety, women who simply didn't fit in. One of his patients was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. Kennedy. Rosemary had mild intellectual disabilities. She was prone to mood swings. Her father, Joseph Kennedy, was worried she'd embarrass the family. He arranged for a lobotomy. Rosemary was 23 years old. The surgery destroyed her. She lost the ability to speak coherently. She lost control of her limbs. She spent the rest of her life institutionalized, essentially an infant in an adult's body. She died in 2005 at the age of 86, having spent over 60 years as a shell of the person she'd been. Let me ask you, how many other women were lobotomized because their families found them inconvenient? We don't know. The records are sealed or destroyed. But we know it was common. Dr. Freeman alone performed over 3,400 lobotomies, and he was just one doctor. The lobotomy wasn't the only surgery. There was also the ovariotomy, removal of the ovaries. Doctors in the 19th century believed that removing a woman's ovaries would cure hysteria. They performed thousands of these surgeries. Some women were sterilized without their knowledge. Some women had their ovaries removed because their husbands complained they were irritable. Think about that. A man goes to a doctor and says, "My wife is irritable." The doctor removes her ovaries. She can never have children again. and no one asks her permission. These weren't fringe doctors. These were respected physicians at prestigious institutions. They published their results in medical journals. They trained other doctors. And for decades, no one stopped them. Now let me show you the pattern, because the women locked away in asylums weren't random, they were targeted. And the targeting followed predictable lines. First, women who challenged male authority. Elizabeth Packard challenged her husband's religious authority. Other women challenged their husband's decisions, or their father's plans for their lives, or their brother's control over family money. Second, women who were inconvenient. The wife of a wealthy man who wanted to marry his mistress. The daughter who stood to inherit money her father wanted to control. The sister whose presence complicated a family's social standing. Third, women who didn't conform. Women who wanted to work instead of marry. Women who loved other women. Women who refused to be quiet, obedient, invisible. Let me ask you, if you were a woman in the 19th century, what would it take for your family to lock you away? A disagreement? An inheritance? A scandal? The answer is, often, very little. One woman was committed because she talked too much. Another because she expressed opinions above her station. Another because she refused to obey her husband's commands. In some cases, women were committed by their own children, a daughter who wanted control of her mother's money, a son who was embarrassed by his mother's behavior. The system was designed to be easy, a signature from a family member, a signature from a doctor who'd never examined the patient, and a lifetime behind walls. And here's the part that should make you angry. When these women died, their families often didn't claim their bodies. They didn't want them buried in family plots. They didn't want any reminder that these women had existed, so they were buried in asylum cemeteries, under numbers, their stories erased, their existence denied. Let me ask you one more question. How many of these women were actually insane when they were committed? Not after years in the asylum. Not after the ice baths and restraints and sedatives. Not after the lobotomies. When they walked through the doors, how many were actually crazy? The answer, historians believe, is far fewer than the records suggest. Now let me tell you about the women we'll never know. The women whose records were destroyed. The women whose families erased them from family Bibles. The women buried in unmarked graves, under numbers that were never matched to names. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, wives. They had names. They had stories. They had lives. And then one day, they were gone. Committed. Forgotten. Erased. Let me tell you about one of them. Her name was Mary. That's all we know. She was admitted to a state asylum in the 1880s. Her husband signed the papers. She never left. When she died, she was buried in the asylum cemetery. Her grave marker was a metal tag with a number. That number was eventually lost. Mary is still there somewhere, in an unmarked grave, waiting for someone to find her. Let me ask you, if Mary were your mother, your sister, your daughter, would you want her found? Would you want her name back? Would you want her story told? The women who survived the asylums, the ones who got out, fought to change the system. They wrote books. They testified before legislatures. They made sure the world knew what happened. But the women who didn't survive, the women who died inside, they have no voice, no books, no testimony. We have to speak for them. We have to tell their stories. We have to remember their names, the ones we know and the ones we'll never know. Because the asylums were designed to make them disappear, and the only way to undo that is to bring them back, to say their names, to mark their graves, to acknowledge that they existed. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Who is being locked away today? Not in asylums. We don't call them that anymore. But in institutions, in nursing homes, in psychiatric wards, in prisons. Who is being labeled difficult and made to disappear? Who is being drugged into compliance? Who is being locked away because someone found them inconvenient? The methods have changed. The language has changed. But the pattern? Let me ask you to think about someone you know. Someone who doesn't fit. Someone who challenges authority. Someone who refuses to be quiet. What happens to them? Where do they go? Who decides? The women of the asylums didn't have a voice. But we have ours. And the least we can do is speak for them, to remember their names, to tell their stories, to make sure that what happened to them is never forgotten and never repeated. Because the only way to keep the doors from closing on someone else is to remember what happened when they closed before. They locked them away because they were inconvenient. They erased their names because they were easier to forget. But the women in those graves are still waiting for someone to say their names out loud.